Okay, now.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on May 22nd, 2022, Global Technopolitics Forum's research team meeting. I don't have much to report, so I would ask Greg to tell us about his traveling and update us on what's going on.
Sure. Well, my trip last week was a quick trip to Washington and New York. The main thing was a small group session mostly on Ukraine in New York. It was interesting. The other main speaker was Garry Kasparov, the chess champion, who was pretty interesting. Yeah, I suppose if you're a chess grandmaster, you shall we say, are entitled to some ego, and he had some, but he's been quite right about Putin and Russia. So it was interesting to listen to him. He was more optimistic than I would be, and he thought that this current war would eventually get Putin, that it would be the end of Putin. He, like most of us, can't see how the war ends without Putin being replaced by somebody. Exactly how that happens, I don't think any of us have a great feel for. I've said, I think before here, that maybe because I lived through the fall of communism and the end of the Soviet Union, I'm skeptical that bottom-up protest is going to make much difference in Russia. So if I see change happening, my best bet, I suppose, would be the military, who have got to hate this war. It's obviously chewing up soldiers and material they can't replace for a cause that my guess is pretty obscure to most of them. It certainly seems to be to the conscripts, many of whom are pretty clueless why they're in Ukraine and why they're fighting the Ukrainians at all. So that was the optimistic piece. The pessimistic piece continues to be, if we think that Putin is going down, maybe even physically, then we worry that he will take some of the rest of us with him. I guess I would say that the nuclear concern has receded a bit. The Russians have talked about it a little less lately, and there's no conceivable target, useful military target for a tactical nuclear weapon in the campaign. So, but fingers crossed on that score. I continue not to be able to see a way this ends, and certainly not a way it ends cleanly. Even if Putin had taken the route we hoped, which was to declare victory and begin to withdraw his troops, even that still would have left Russia as a pariah state, Putin as a potential war criminal, and presumably left all the sanctions in place. So that would have been a kind of a messy, more of a ceasefire than an end. That's about as far as I can imagine that we get a kind of a ceasefire that sometimes holds. I mean, you look at what the last 8 years, that's what we had. We had a peace agreement that never went anywhere. We had a ceasefire that was honored as often in the breach. My guess is we're in for something like that for the future, which is pretty dismal.
Thank you, Greg. Any comments from anybody?
I have a question for Greg. Greg, I've heard this kill switch concept that Putin may have in place. If anything happens to him, he has left instructions for some kind of a terrible nuclear incident to occur as a kind of insurance policy. Do you think that that's true? And if so, what are our options in terms of regime change in Russia?
Yeah, I'm technically it's hard to imagine how he does that in a way that is entirely reliable. Somebody's going to have to do something, and once he's dead, it's not clear that someone would do that. Maybe. So I guess I'm a little skeptical of it on purely technical grounds. But that he might try to do something like that. That seems to me, unfortunately, part of this. If he's going down and wants to take a lot of people with us, so I don't know. Short of I think on the one hand, we've done a good job of keeping the coalition together, and intelligence has been an interesting piece of trying to keep one step ahead of Putin, or at least not let him get one step ahead of us. That's been really interesting. we may have talked about it a little bit too much. I think that one thing to help the Ukrainians target the Moskva and target Russian generals, probably not a good idea to talk about it, right? I tend to think that if you have a bear with a wounded paw, the last thing you want to do is say, oh, and I set the trap, right? So I think we're probably talking a little less, but what we might say about that possibility, I think, continuing to make the point that there is absolutely no sense for even thinking or talking about anything nuclear in this circumstance, probably the best, maybe the only thing we can really do. I don't know if anybody has any other ideas.
Personally, I think that if Putin for any reason is killed, I doubt anybody else would follow instruction, even if instructions are placed. Because if they can get to him and kill him, the next person would feel quite endangered and frightened as well. So I doubt if such a thing could even work, even if he has placed instructions.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Concerns, buddy. And what Eduardo is saying has some sense because of two reasons, which I could probably say with a certain degree of confidence. One, in Kremlin, there are multiple layers, and these multiple layers are very loyal people to Putin will surround him. So there are 5 to 6 layers which encircle Putin. And those are the kind of some 50 people who are within the very core group encircling Putin. And then, they have got hierarchy, which is sort of backed up. If something happens to X, Y will follow through. If something happens to Y, the next person in charge will follow through. So that is the one thing which we cannot really deny, because Kremlin and Russia, they both are very enigmatic. So it's very, very difficult for anybody to say what might happen if something goes wrong with Putin. So there are circles and there are people. So there will not be any problem in terms of an immediate succession planning being put in place that might have been put in place already. The second part, which Eduardo said, the blue book by which KGB agents are trained, they're trained in such a way that when the end comes to them, is kill switch. So whoever you have around you, given the fact that the person himself or herself is in a danger zone, then that person will or can do anything. It is like the nuclear doctrine, if there is anything happening to the country and something is wrong there, they can probably trigger the command, and then everything will start going. So these are the two things that we need to really remember, that there are different layers of circles surrounding Putin. So if anything goes wrong with him, we will not really, we should not really worry about who and when and all. So they have got the succession planning in place. And the second one is kill switch, is a kind of a training, part of the training project through which KGB agents are trained. These are the two things that we need to really remember are very, very critical and very enigmatic with regard to how they really operate.
Yeah, but I think if he's killed, which is theoretical, but that means the layers has been penetrated already. So we got to realize that if it happens, that means the situation is changed. So whoever is in charge, they realize that layers and that system has lost its integrity. But I'll let Greg to respond. Greg, any thoughts on that?
I think that's probably right. The incentives to the people who are left would face would be a little bit hard to predict, right? And I think you're right that something dramatic would have already happened. I've never been quite sure how much. Well, it's plain to me that there's a considerable tension between the military and the intelligence services in Russia. Exactly how that plays out, would play out in that circumstance, the episode I suppose we can remember is 1983, when we came probably as close as we've ever had, ever to a major nuclear exchange. And in that case, the Russian general, who was in the sort of in the hot seat, basically decided on his own that what he was seeing was a false alarm, not American missiles coming at Russia, and didn't move forward with retaliation. So that's maybe, I don't know whether that's a hopeful sign, but at least it suggests that there are people in that loop that might or might not carry out Putin's wishes.
I want to now move our conversation to a different story. Considering what is happening geopolitically, it had impact on internet, and increasingly there is debate about how West should ensure that they are united when it comes to internet and more empowered than the Eastern alliances. So 3 points has been made. One is data sharing, the need to share data across border within Western countries. Second is investing in infrastructure. And third is developing common standards. Any other point comes to anybody's mind when it comes to empowering and uniting Western powers in terms of internet? And one reason for these three concepts are because different countries have different, they're strong on different aspects, and different aspects empowers certain strategies or actions. So each country or some of the countries are strong in some points and others are strong in another. And the thought is if we bring all these strengths together through a common data sharing, strong infrastructure and common standards, then we can shift the West to be far more powerful.
Honey, you must have talked about the session you did in one of these meetings I missed, right?
The SplinterNet?
Yes, the SplinterNet session.
Yes, actually, I talked about it. I don't know if who was there. I'm sure Puran was there. I don't know if Firuze or Eduardo were there. But yeah, I talked about the SplinterNet.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the concept of a SplinterNet was at the beginning of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, or aggression of Russia on Ukraine, better word. There was a request made by Ministry of Information and Vice President of Ukraine from Internet foundations to switch internet in Russia completely off. So that create a lot of concern within Internet Foundation governance, Internet governance foundations, various organizations. And the response was a collective sympathizing, but no. And the idea was to focus on integrity of Internet, and that's what they thought was their job to safeguard. But it created a lot of, it even impacted the sanctions. So they have to come up with ideas that to exempt certain companies from sanctions to ensure that Russia remains connected rather than completely switching off from internet.
Sorry, I have a question for you on that front, which is how likely is it that we will move increasingly towards a kind of iron curtain, cyber iron curtain, in which we have on one side one internet ecosystem, and then on the other side another internet ecosystem, that each side is influenced by different values and norms, as you said. Of course, there's going to be some points of contact and confluence, but over the next 10, 20, 50 years, are we likely to move into that reality in which we have these different online ecosystems? Obviously, one that connects, say, China, Russia, and other countries, maybe even India. Puran, I'd like to hear your thoughts there. And then a Western version that connects the North Atlantic with different forms of censorship as well. A lot of people have been observing that the internet did create a flood of information and a participation amongst the citizenry in information streams that is now witnessing a kind of backlash, a kind of counter-reformation, as we had the Reformation in Europe and then the counter-reformation, which the church cracked down with the Inquisition. Now we're seeing that online as well, with various disinformation boards springing up here and there. So can we expect that over the long term, Pari?
I think there are two, the integrity of internet is endangered from two different camps. One is a very innovative camp that is now coming with the idea of totally decentralized internet, because as you guys know, internet, when it comes to ICANN and IANA, it's centralized. So the core of internet remains centralized, and therefore we have network of networks working properly. That system, through innovative forms of activists, is under attack. Now, to what extent they are using blockchain technology to decentralize DNS system. That's sometimes going to happen, but in what form and shape it will happen and when, we don't know. And again, there is a large number of, again, innovative activists that are trying to bring that blockchain decentralized concept under some form of control. But that's very different from a splinternet that we're talking about. Also, the effect more or less would be similar. It's going to create a lot of chaotic action. But then if you're talking about having, for example, Russia has its own internet, Iran has its own internet, and China has its own internet, to a certain point, it's already happening. However, because being on the network of networks is so beneficial to every single country, as long as we're living within current system, when governments are still in charge and making decisions and private sector making money out of it, a complete splinter net is, I don't think it's in horizon. However, we will have fragmentation, so a small, what we have already, meaning, for example, China has a firewall around the country, but still it's part and parcel of network of networks, and use values, then activists use values, forms and technologies to connect and break their control. So they're introducing control. That will continue, and it's a matter of a game of, cat and mouse. They would create control, and activists come up with ways of breaking the control and additional control. Or Europe will come with GDPR and more restricted standards and requirements and legislation. In fact, Europe has started to have DNS for Europe. So now we are going to have a DNS for Europe, which is quite concerning for EU, quite concerning. So these things are happening everywhere, but nobody wants to lose the benefit of being online. And that's like trade system. Doesn't matter how much problem is, nobody want to be out of the global trade system. So I think 50 years is too far away to think about. But within, let's say, 5-year period, because, in technology, we can't really think about 10 years. Within next 4 or 5 years, I don't think we see any major changes.
It's interesting to me that there isn't, on the standards front, there doesn't seem to be even a very vigorous European-American discussion. You'd expect that would be going on, but it doesn't seem to be. Maybe that's an opportunity for us, but I think on the standards front, that would be happening already. Pardon my voice. Maybe there's more happening that I just don't see, but.
It seems like as long as you have ideological governments, that there will be a constant push to come up with that sort of a cyber iron curtain with Iran, with China, because these are not just, it's not just the government functioning, but they're ideological inherently. And so then that sort of an iron curtain is always going to be in the mix of things, I think.
That seems right.
Yep. So beyond that, Firuze, do you have any update for us?
Yeah, I was actually, Lebanon had an election, and thank you for the link you sent me. That was a very interesting webinar, because it was right after the elections that they were chatting. There was a human rights feminist element on it, and there's an economist on it, and so it was interesting to see them a little bit spar. One was man and one was the woman, so that was also interesting in the context of the Middle East. One major thing that came out of these elections is that Hezbollah and his bloc, their blocs lost seats in the government, so they don't even have a majority to elect a prime minister. That's going to be a challenge. Hariri has stepped down. And actually the future movements, his party boycotted the election to a large degree. Some of the candidates in the future movement decided to run as independents. One thing that they were lauding about this particular election is that up to now, the political language was always a sectarian language, but since October, there has been a push towards more of a common language, which met in the streets through the demonstrations and this push for the revolution. And in this particular election, a whole new set of independence gained ground. And so that is cause for optimism, and that is cause for kind of like a better outlook, but mitigating that with a lot of challenges economically. 90% of the wheat that Lebanon gets is from Ukraine and Russia. So that paints you a picture right there. Since 2020, the GDP had contracted over 21%. On top of that, in 2021, another 10%, and in 2022, another 6%. IMF is still holding on with the bailout until the bank reforms and the audits are in place. And so far, there has been a standoff. But with the independence coming in, there has been, there's going to be a movement, hopefully, on that front. But the reforms that have been requested by the IMF are the hardest, even worse than more difficult than the ones in Argentina. Already all the fuel subsidies have been lifted, the food subsidies have been lifted. Sorry, 1 second.
I love the mask.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
Okay.
And they want to increase taxes. So all of these things are going to be very hard for Lebanese who are already really, really hurting. And so this will be a main challenge for the new government. So we have 3 different things happening. So, okay, the independents are in, but they have the challenge on the economic front, and also the challenge of forming a new government because nobody has a clear majority in the parliament. So, and then also there is this, there are 2 camps between all the technical aspects of reform and also human rights aspects. There is a lot of violence, against same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights, human rights for the migrants. Like one of the women who's just been elected is a proponent of getting rid of all the Syrian migrants, for instance, like extremely racist, there are a lot of civil liberty issues in the mix, And the economist on the panel was saying, we don't have time to worry about that. We have technical things to worry about. And the feminist was like, no, these things have to happen at the same time. If we enact laws that don't take into consideration human rights and civil liberties, then those are not good laws. So we had a little bit of like that polarized situation where which one is it? Is it possible to put one on the back burner while you concentrate on the economic issues at hand? So it was an interesting panel, and again, elucidating all the challenges that they have on multiple fronts in Lebanon. So that's what's going on.
Great. If you wanted to write an update on the white paper we had, feel free to do it. But I know you're traveling and you may be busy. If you had time, would be great.
Okay.
Any comment from anybody? Anything anyone wants to discuss?
Greg, I have a little question for you. While we have been talking about Russia, Ukraine, and we tend to sort of forget and forgive China. And the fact that US President is in Asia on his tour to South Korea, and now he's in Japan, and there'll be a Quad meeting as well. How do you really sort of look at this China kind of a thing, which is, Bennett, and nobody's really, caring about it much, and everybody's getting concerned about Russia. What do you think might be happening with regard to China? And what about China's claim, which might follow, if not immediately, then over time on Taipei? So what do you really think will really happen with regard to Asia and China and US President coming to Korea and Japan, and then there's a Quad meeting as well lined up, tomorrow and the day after. How do you really see China factor playing? And is there any quid pro quo between Chinese and Russians? And China is not being seen at all, but then they have been trying to play the part in a very, very stealth way, which might prove to be pretty disastrous by the time we come to know about what they're up to.
A really good, big set of issues. We could spend most of the afternoon on them, I think. For me, China is still the big game. Russia is obviously important and a terrible nuisance at the moment, but it is, in one way or another, a declining power, not a rising power. So in the long run, as I said in New York, I said, when I did Global Trends, released Global Trends in 2017, Carl Bildt, the Swedish foreign minister and prime minister, good friend, did us the honor of coming to the opening ceremony. And I asked him, I said, how long do you think it will be before we worry more about how Russia being too weak than being too strong? And he said about 10 years, he thought. Well, it seems to me Putin has sort of hastened that timetable. So I think, for all our concern, just justifiably now about Russia, China is still the main game, and therefore trying to work out this combination of competition and cooperation with China, which is really imperative, still seems to me to be the main item on the foreign policy agenda. I had hoped, I probably said this here, that that China's position would be sufficiently uncomfortable on Ukraine. And on the one hand, they've given rhetorical support to Putin, but on the other hand, he's doing exactly what 50 years of Chinese communist orthodoxy have said is undoable. He's violated sovereignty, he's committed aggressions, all the things the Chinese have stood for their entire existence, he's violated. I also thought she must be a little uncomfortable about Taiwan, because the Ukraine thing has prompted a kind of parallelism between concern about Ukraine being violated and Taiwan being violated. And that's going to be hard for Xi, because whatever we think about the war in Ukraine, Ukraine's situation as an independent country was much stronger than Taiwan's, which we all recognize in one way or another as part of China, whatever that means. So that's got to be uncomfortable for him too. I'd hope that would move him further than it has. He finally, I guess, got to the point of condemning the violation of sovereignty, but we'd hoped at one point that he might play a kind of mediating role, but he obviously isn't sufficiently discomforted by this. But this has got to be, I would imagine, it's got to be a source of some considerable tension in Chinese-Russian relations, even if China reaps some benefits from it in terms of oil and other supplies. So I think this is an interesting moment, and it's important for us to keep our eyes focused on what is, for me, still the big game, and that's China.
Mhm. Is it possible that China is waiting and buying time to step in after Russia is sufficiently weakened?
Maybe. I've always thought that their partnership had to be a rather tense one, mostly because in any real partnership, Russia would be the minor partner, not the major partner, and that doesn't seem any part of what Putin imagines for his future. So I've been skeptical of how far the partnership could extend. Obviously, there's been lots of mutual back scratching in the short run. India's also benefited, right, from Iran, from big oil supplies, right? So there is that mutual back scratching, and I don't know how much by way of helping Russia with spare parts China has done or is even able to do, but there's probably some of that going on as well. But I put this mostly in the mutual back scratching category.
Mhm. Okay, any comment from anybody? No? Firza, I have a new article. It's actually a research done by Talia. It would be good if you have time, and only if you have time. Do you think you can edit it? It's just I need a fast edit before I publish it. It's about
Sure.
20 pages. Most of it are links, and it's going to be, I don't think it's going to take more than an hour or two because it's a very fast read. Do you think you would have time? Oh, thank you very much.
Okay.
I would.
Great, thank you.
So on that note, I think if there's nothing else to discuss, I want to thank you everybody for being here, and wish you a wonderful week ahead, and see you next week.
Well, it's nice to be back. Sorry to have missed so many.
Yes.
Thank you.
Glad to have you
Nice
back.
to have you back. Yes.
Yes.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.